So let's go over reproduction in plants. And the first thing we want to understand is just the term reproduction. So when I'm talking about reproduction, this is just a biological process through which organisms get to reproduce. And the main purpose of this reproduction is to make sure that there's a continuation of life. Because if there was no reproduction, if organisms get to die, that means at one point or the other, all of them are going to die and there will be nothing to continue life. So this is all for the continuation of life. Now, when you're talking about reproduction, there are two types. We've got sexual and asexual. Now, how do we get to differentiate these two types of reproduction? So, asexual reproduction is when an organism produces a genetically identical offspring without the contribution of genetic material from the other organism. So, that is what we mean by asexual. So, basically, here you are going to have an identical organism, and here there is no interaction with the other with another individual, or in other words, in this kind of reproduction there is no sex involved. When we're talking about sexual reproduction, of course, is the direct opposite of what we've just said here. So the individuals are not necessarily identical when it comes to sexual reproduction, and there is also the coming together of gametes. Those are sex cells together to form a new organism. Now, when you're talking about the production such that you are going to have identical, let's say, offspring, the offspring is identical to the parent, this happens more, it's more just like a division. For example, you have got what we call binary fission. So you have got this organism with a nucleus here. So what is going to be happening is this organism will start to divide. The first thing that is going to divide, the nucleus is going to divide. So we're going to get something like this. The nucleus gets to starts dividing. Okay, it goes like that, and then in another stage you are going to find that the nucleus has divided. So some organisms are going to end up just like this, and the cell membrane might not be able to separate. And so in this case, you are going to see organisms that have got two nuclei in them. Okay. And so what is going to happen again in this type of reproduction is these now are going to separate. You are going to see them like that. So it's going to cut on the middle. So we're going to have one part and then another part. And these two parts both contain a nucleus. And the information that is in this one is the same genetic information that also just like in that other one. So these two are all the same because they just come from a division, so which involves no sex at all. So the kind of reproduction here, the individuals are the same. When you talk of sexual reproduction, this involves sex, and you can think of it, not everyone looks like their parents. Okay, that is a simple example that we are able to give. So gametes are reproductive cells when you are talking about sexual reproduction. So here gametes are involved. Now, when you are talking about gametes, these are simply reproductive cells that contain half the number of chromosomes as a normal body cell. So, for example, in a human being, each human being has got 46 chromosomes and they are in 23 pairs. So, there are 46, you can think of it one here, one here. So, we count this as one. So, there are going to be 23 pairs in a human being. So when it comes now to gametes, gametes do not contain 23 pairs. They only contain half the 23 pairs. So in other words, they just contain 23 chromosomes. Because a human being contains 46 chromosomes in pairs. Now, when you're talking about chromosomes, what are chromosomes? Chromosomes are structures which contain DNA. And DNA is what determines the characteristics of a person, how you are going to look, how your hair is going to be, your skin color, and just a lot of things about you. It is the same chromosome that also contain which carry some diseases, okay, those which we call sex linked characteristics. For example, hemophilia is going to be carried on a chromosome. So these are some things that are contained in a chromosome. So what is going to happen is, from a male you are going to gain 23 chromosomes, from a female gain also 23 chromosomes. When these two come together, you are now going to form 46 chromosomes. So each cell in the body is called a somatic cell, and each cell contains 46 chromosomes. But when you are talking about gametes, gametes are called sex cells. Sex cells only contain 23 pairs, 23 chromosomes. And then somatic cells contain 46. Or we can also say somatic cells contain 23 pairs. If I say a pair, I mean 2 2, and that is going to give us 46. So examples of sex cells, you've got sperm cells, and also the ovum in females. So these are what we have. Now, because we're talking about reproduction in plants, we need to understand the structure of a plant, or in this case we're going to use a flower, the structure of a flower and how this reproduction gets to happen. So this is the basic structure of a flower. We have got the female part of a flower and the male part of a flower. Okay, and basically when we're talking about flowers, of course they undergo different types of we're talking about, in this case, reproduction, and we're going to understand that later. So let's first just get to understand the structures of these parts of a flower. So when we just start from the very bottom, this stalk, we have got a pedicel. Now what is a pedicel? Pedicel, the other name is called flower stalk. Okay, so when you're talking about the pedicel, this just modifies the stems that hold the flower. This is just the same kind, more like a stem that holds the flower so that it doesn't get too far. That is what we call as a pedicel. And then from here we have got receptacle, or receptacle in, sorry for that pronunciation. Here is the receptacle. Now, what is a receptacle? Why is it there in a flower? So receptacles, these are the ends of the pedicel which hold the plant or the flower. Okay, so the pedicel itself holds the flower, but the receptacle, this holds just the parts of the flower. You can see that almost all the parts have come to connect at this point. So that is a receptacle which gets to hold those different parts. Apart from that, we've got sepals. So here is a sepal, this small part which is down here. Now we're going to understand what's the function of these sepals which we have. So when you're talking about sepals, these are modified leaves, like small leaves which we are able to see here, and they are mostly green in color because they are at the very bottom there and are found on the outermost ring of the flower. So they make up the what we call the calyx of a flower, and these are there just for the protection. So they get to protect the flower when it is in a bud stage. So in that stage when the flower is more like forming, so these are going to, they more like cover up like that. So in that stage when the flower is growing, so these are there for protection, the sepals. Okay, so apart from the sepal, we have got petals, also petals, which you are able to see. This is now the big part, the whole of this part we are able to see the flower, that's called the petal. Now when you're talking about petals, petals are modified leaves which form the most conspicuous part of the flower, the most the biggest part of the flower, the most attractive part of the flower, that is what we call the petal. So they make up what is called, remember the sepal, we said they make up what is called the calyx. Now petals make up what is called the corolla. Okay, so when we're talking about these petals, they are brightly colored in insect pollinated plants and form a platform for insects to land on. So this is where, like in insect pollinated flowers, this is where the insects are going to be landing. The bees are going to be landing there on the petals in insect pollinated flowers. Well, in some other flowers which are not insect pollinated, you might not be able to see the petals like this, the way they are. Apart from the petals, we've got what we call the carpel, and we can see that the carpel has got three parts: the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So when we're talking about this carpel, these are just the female part of the flower which gets to receive the, remember there should be a transfer of pollens or pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. So the stigma is the female part and the anther is the male part. So when pollen grains are moving from the anther to the stigma, so that is the process of pollination. Now the carpel makes up the female reproductive part of the flower. So it contains an ovary with one or more ovules, the ovules which you can see here, and then it also contains the sticky part which we call the stigma. So the stigma is sticky such that when the pollens are moving, the pollen grains are moving from the anther, as they go to this part, they are going to stick and not be able to fall off. So that is the carpel. The female part of the flower. Also have the stamen, which is the female part of the flower. Now let's first understand some of these parts of the carpel. We've got the stigma, which we can see here. Of course, the stigma is different from these others. You can see I've put the stigma in white, and the others which I've put in green, those are anthers. So the stigma is a receptor for pollen grains. This is what receive pollen grains during the process of pollination. And when we're talking about the stigma again, it secretes a sugary fluid that stimulates germination of pollen grains. So what is happening is that this same stigma releases something that is sugary. Okay, it releases a fluid which is more like, you can think of a fluid more like let's say more like water, something like that, and that fluid is sugar, it has more like sugar. And this one is what stimulates, this sugary fluid is what stimulates or is what makes germination of pollen grains. Okay, so that is on the stigma. So it's going to be able to receive the pollen grains, and it also releases that fluid which is sugary that is going to stimulate the germination of pollen grains. We also have the style. Now you can see that the style is just more like a stem, the stem that holds the stigma. So that is a style. It holds the stigma in position to make sure that the stigma gets to trap pollen grains. And then we've got the ovary. So the ovary, you can see that the ovary, each ovary contains one or more ovules. So that's the function of the ovary, to contain the ovules. Now what are the function of the ovules? So the ovule contains what we call female gametes. Okay, female gametes. That is what the ovule contains. They are more like eggs we are talking about here. So for you to be able to produce children, there should be eggs that are going to where children are going to come from, or offsprings are going to come from. So the ovule contains female gametes or female reproductive cells. That's what the ovule does, or that is what the ovule contains. And then we've got the stamen, which is there. The stamen, these are just male reproductive organs. It consists of the anther and the filament, as we can see these two parts. Now the anther contains pollen grains. So the anther contains pollen grains which are going to move to the stigma during pollination. And then we have got the filament. The filament is a stalk that just holds the anther. Just like the star is a stalk that holds the stigma, filament is a stalk that holds the anther in position to make sure that pollen grains are dispersed, or to make sure that pollen grains are released to go to the stigma. Okay, so this is it on the flower. Now, a flower can have multiple carpels. These carpels were able to see, like the female parts of the flower, they can be a lot. So multiple carpels form what is called a pistil. So when you have got a lot of these parts, a lot of female reproductive parts, which you call the carpels, then a lot of them together, that is going to form what is called a pistil. So this is the structure of an insect pollinated flower. So mostly an insect pollinated flower, we can see is going to have a large brightly colored flower. So it's going to be bright and large. As you can see, the petals here are very big. No, I'm not pointing to the anther, I'm pointing to this part. It's very big. It's going to be large and also that attractive. In other words, it's going to be colored. And then another thing I'm talking about, an insect pollinated flower is going to have a scent, a nice scent that attracts insects to be able to go there. Okay, apart from the scent, also the nectar. There is a nectar that is present on an insect pollinated flower. So nectar is more where the insects are going to be able to feed, more like they are feeding. There is a fluid that is produced for the insect to be able to feed on there. Okay, there is also the stamen. Okay, when you look at the stamen now of an insect pollinated flower, the stamen of an insect pollinated flower is non-pendulous and do not protrude out of the flower. So you can see these stamens, they do not move out of the flower, like they are not outside, they are just within the flower. That is for an insect pollinated flower. These are characteristics that we need to know for an insect pollinated flower. If we look also at the stigma of an insect pollinated flower, they are small and compact. They do not protrude out of the flower. In other words, they also don't move outside the flower. So we're using the word protrude. That's to mean to move out. So they are also just stuck inside the flower like that. Also, when you look at the pollen grain of an insect pollinated flower, they are fairly abundant, like there are a lot of them, and they are large and sticky. The reason as to why they should be large and sticky is whenever an insect reaches or lands on the flower, they should be able to stick, so that by the time the insect goes to the stigma, they are going to remain on the stigma more like that. Or when the insect goes to another flower, they are going to carry those pollen grains, and when they carry them, they are going to be distributed, and by that there will be reproduction that is going to be happening. So that is why the pollen grains are large and sticky. Okay, we've looked at an insect pollinated flower. What of a wind pollinated flower? How does it look like? So this is how a wind pollinated flower is going to look like. You can see that for it, the petals are not like the way they are in the insect pollinated flower. In this case, you can see we've got bracts, and you can see the stigma and the stamen, they are outside the flower. And the reason of this is that, they should be outside, so that when the wind blows, the pollen grains are able to move from the stigma, I mean from the anther to the stigma, like that. That is why they should be outside. So in a wind pollinated flower, we've got the flowers are small, as we can see, and then color is not supposed to be bright, because you don't need to attract insects. So for bright colored flowers, they are there for attraction of insects, but here the color is not supposed to be bright, and then there's no need for the flower to have a nice scent to attract insects. And also there is no nectar. That sweet part of the flower is not there, because the insects will not be coming to the flower to feed. Okay, so flower parts are protected by leaf-like structures which are called bracts. These ones we can see here. So these parts are there to protect the flower parts. We don't have all those different parts like we have got in the animal, I mean in the insect pollinated flower. And the stamens are long. Okay, the stamens are also long, as we can see. These parts, they are so long that makes the stigma and the anthers to be outside, to be outside the plant. So when you look at the stigmas are also very large and they are extended, and also they are feathery. We can see the stigmas are feathery here. And why are the stigmas feathery? The reason of that is so that when the wind comes, they are able to blow. Okay, they have got large surface area to make sure that they trap small and light pollen grains. So the male parts of the flower are outside. Since the male parts of the flower are outside, when the wind comes, the pollen grains are going to be blown away. So when the pollen grains are blown away, the stigma is such big such that they are able to trap. Okay, they are able to trap the pollen grains. So this is how a wind pollinated flower looks like, and that is just a general structure of a wind pollinated flower. So for a wind pollinated flower, there is no need for a scent. Nectar is not there because nectar is the sweet part of the flower. There is no need of the nectar because there will not be no insect to come and feed. And then when you talk about the stigma, they are large, they are feathery, and they are big. They protrude outside. That is the stigma. Okay, like they go outside, they point outside the flower. When you look at the pollen grains have a lot, and they are small and light. The reason as to why they are small and light is because when the wind blows, they should be able to move away from the plant and be carried away by the wind. And wherever they reach, perhaps they come and reach on the stigma. They'll get to stick there like that. And then reproduction is going to happen. So the flowers do not have a bright color. There is no need for a bright color. And the flower parts are protected by what we call bracts, which we are able to see here. So this is a wind pollinated flower. Now we also need to understand pollination. So what is pollination? So pollination is simply the transfer of pollen grains. Now when you are transferring these pollen grains, it's moving from the anther, that is the male part of the flower, to the stigma, and the stigma, that is the female part of the flower. So that is what we call pollination. So in this process, the reason as to why pollination is happening is because when the pollen grains move from the anther to the stigma, then a process called fertilization is going to happen. Well, and the question is going to be, what is fertilization? So fertilization is simply the coming together of a male and a female gamete. So in this case, the male gametes are the pollen grains. If it is in humans, you can say these are sperms. Okay, so they are going to move from the anther to the stigma. Now, there are different mechanisms through which pollination can happen. There are insect pollination and wind pollination, as you've seen from insect pollinated flowers and wind pollinated flowers. So for insect pollinated flowers, they contain nectar and they've got a nectar guard which uh, are visible to insects. So when you're talking about nectar guard, nectar is just a sweet part of the flower. Now nectar guard, these are visible to insects. In other words, they guard insects to be able to locate their flower, and the insects are going to go there. So when the insect enters the flower, pollen grains from the anther stick onto the insect. Okay, so here is the anther. When the insect enters this flower, the pollen grains which are on the anther are going to be able to stick to the insect. So if pollen grains from a previously visited flower are present on the insect, they will be transferred to the sticky stigma. So as the insect gets to move now, remember the pollen grains have stuck on the insect, and then when the insect goes on the stigma, they are going to stick there because the stigma is also sticky. Okay. Now for wind pollinated flowers, they've got pollen which are carried by wind when the anther is exposed, and when the wind gets to blow, the pollen grains are going to just be blown by the air. So that is how the pollen grains are going to be transferred. Okay. So when the pollen grains come into contact with the large feathery stigmas, which we are able to see, it can be of the same flower or another flower. Then the pollen grains are going to be trapped. So when they are trapped, then now fertilization is going to happen. So we have got two types of pollination. There is self-pollination and also cross-pollination. Remember, this is just the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. So it can either be self or cross. Alright, so when you're talking about these two types of pollination, firstly starting with self-pollination, and then here we've got cross-pollination. Now when you're talking about self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Okay, so here you're just talking about the same flower. But when you're talking about cross-pollination, it will be from the anther of one flower to the stigma of a different flower. So there are different flowers which are involved in cross-pollination. Okay, now what are the factors that promote self-pollination? Well, when you're talking about self-pollination, the factors which promote this kind of pollination is when you're talking about one, bisexual flowers. So bisexual flowers, these are simple flowers that have got an anther and the stigma, and these two are maturing at the same time. So because the male and the female parts are already there, the flower is just going to pollinate itself. So those flowers are called bisexual flowers. And then now we are saying the male and the female parts are going to be maturing at the same time. Then that is called a bisexual flower, and then self-pollination is going to be able to happen. And then another factor that promotes uh, self-pollination is when the stigma is located directly below the anther. Okay, look at this structure which we have here. When the stigma is located directly below the anther. So in other words, if the stigma here is much shorter, let's say the stigma is like this, and then the anther is much longer, so the pollen grains are able to fall like that on the stigma, which is the female part. And because of that, pollination is going to happen. Pollen grains have been transferred from the anther to the stigma because the stigma is below. So that is one also factor. Now, what are the advantages of self-pollination? So when you're talking about advantages of self-pollination, one, they do not depend on external agents of pollination such as insects or wind. That is one important thing. They do not depend on external agents. Apart from not depending on external agents such as wind and insects, there are also less wastage of pollen and energy, because during wind and insect pollination, a great number of pollen grains are lost. Just think of it like when the wind blows, you don't even know the direction in which wind is going to blow. Or when an insect comes in, you don't even know where the insect is going to go. Maybe where it goes, the pollen grains are going to reach another place. But when you're talking about self-pollination, uh, pollen grains are not going to be more wasted because they're just going to be dropping, and few of them are going to be missing instead of going to the stigma, they go down. So few of them are going to do that. So there's no wastage of pollen grains, and there's less wastage of energy, like the energy just to transport the pollen grains. When we're talking about wind pollination, for them just to be able to move from one plant to the other plant, that wastes energy. Okay. And then another thing, only one parent plant is required, so that is also another advantage. Only one parent plant is going to be required. You don't need a lot of plants. Now the disadvantages of self-pollination is that there's greater genetic variation, hence the offspring have higher chance of surviving. I mean, a disadvantage we're talking about for self-pollination is less genetic variation. You can think of this, it's the same parent, and so even the offspring that are going to be arising, they are going to be more like the same, because the offspring will not be that different from the parents. You can explain this like, imagine this is the parent, and then it pollinates itself. The parent might just look, the offspring might just look exactly more like the parents. Because of this is why we're saying there is less genetic variation. So the offsprings are not going to be different much from the parents. If there are some diseases in the parent, even the offsprings are going to carry the same disease. Why? Because obviously the diseases are in the DNA, and the DNA has been also transferred to the offspring. So if the diseases are contained in the parent, then even those same diseases are going to be in the offspring, because there's no much difference between the two. Now when you're talking about cross pollination, which happens in different flowers, cross pollination is going to happen between different flowers. And what are the factors that promote cross pollination? One thing is plants bearing only male or female parts. So here we're talking about bisexual, that is why self-pollination is promoted. But if you have got plants which do not have a male and a female part just in the same plant, so such plants are going to go for cross-pollination, because they have got, some of them they might just have the anther without the stigma, some of them they just have the stigma without the anther. So there's no choice but to undergo cross-pollination. And then also in some parts, I mean in plants with bisexual flowers, the anther and the stigma mature at different times. So if the anther and the stigma mature at different times, imagine the anther has already matured, meaning the pollen grains are ready to be released, but the stigma is not there to gain the pollen grains. So the pollen grains would rather go in a different plant, so that is going to be cross pollination. So that is also another factor. And then another thing is self incompatibility, or self incompatibility. Okay, now what do we mean incompatibility? So in other words, we're talking about being incapable. So when you're talking about this reason, when a pollen grain of a flower happens to land on the stigma of the same flower or another flower on the same plant, a biochemical block prevents the pollination from germination. Okay. So we're saying when a pollen grain of a flower happens to land on the stigma of the same flower or another flower on the same plant, a biochemical block prevents the pollination from happening. So when there's just a reaction that gets to happen, like the plant itself makes this reaction, which blocks the germination from happening. Just a reaction by the flower itself blocks the germination from happening. So that is what we are saying, self incompatibility. So the flower itself is preventing germination from happening. So that is why the pollen grains would rather go to another plant, and then germination is going to happen like that. Okay. Some advantages of cross pollination is there are going to be genetic variation. So if there is one disease that is in one parent, you transfer the pollen grains to another plant, the disease might not be seen in the offspring. Why? Because you are combining two different plants. If you combine something normal with something sick, well, the offspring might just be normal. So that would be different from where it is from the same plant, other than where they are in the same plant. If one is sick, the other one is also sick, then even the offspring is also going to be sick. But these are different plants. So if this plant 1 is sick, plant 2 is not sick, then there's a chance that the offspring might be what? Might be normal. And also genetic variation, instead of just everything looking the same, they might be able to look different. Instead of just the offspring, or the characteristics which are in the parents, they are also in the offsprings. So there will be a difference in that case. So that is what we call genetic variation. Okay. Because of genetic variation, there can be a big chance of survival, because some characteristics that are in some plants make them not to be okay, they make them to die. But if there's a variation, the plants might just be able to survive. Another thing is offsprings may have inherited beneficial qualities from both parents. So there are some qualities that can be inherited from one parent and the other parent. Remember, it is between two different plants. So because of that, that can cause an inheritance of some nice qualities. Now, the disadvantages when you're talking about cross pollination is there is energy consuming. Okay, when you're talking about energy consuming, lots of energy is required to make large amount of pollen grains. Like you are transferring these a lot of pollen grains from one plant to the other. This means that you have to make a lot of them, because if not, if the wind blows, the pollen grains might just fall before reaching the other plant, and because of that there will be no germination, there will be no fertilization happening. So you need a lot of pollen grains to be transferred, and because of that there is energy consumption. Okay, and then a greater number of pollen grains are also wasted. That is another thing. All right, so these are some things that we should be able to understand when we're talking about pollination and also reproduction in plants.